that. I don't. Anyway, it's not really relevant to today's conversation in any way, shape, or form. But the Welsh government has actually been putting up a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and as things stand, when that 6-month period expires, they're just going to pull the plug. It's just going to stop. So there's a lot of fears about what's going to happen to people. Lord Harrington, I don't know if you were listening yesterday when I was waxing lyrical about the state of the small boat scandal in the English Channel, and a former Conservative immigration minister rang in to agree with me. Quite spectacular, really. But another Conservative immigration minister very concerned, suggesting that host families should get more money. So we may get onto that from 12. Let me just rejig the conversation that we're having now. I'll speak to Richard in Wimbledon in a moment. But we've heard from a lot of teachers. We've heard from lawyers. Is there a sector that I don't mention? Are you feeling the strain? Are the pips beginning to squeak where you work? And it's not one of those areas that, because it might not be huge, but it's not one of those areas that has a lot of attention, that routinely gets a lot of attention. So I think that's quite a nice way. So the first time I remember we got our head around what leaving the single market was likely to do to import exports in this country, we were speaking to a brilliant caller who describes himself as a van driver. He's actually much more than that. But do you see what I mean? Sometimes the lenses through which we view the world are not clear enough, or we don't have enough of them. So what are you doing? A bit like, was it Adam in Victoria talking about being a television aerial installer? The notion of, well, I'm not in one of the sectors that you talk about all the time, James. I'm not a flipping lawyer or a lorry driver or a care worker or a teacher, but I do something a little bit less obvious. This is what's happening where I am. This is what's happening to us. Because I'm relaxed now, but it takes quite a lot to do the iceberg question. Have we already hit it? I think we probably have, but I don't know what it's like from where you are. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need, okay? It's 11:38. Richard is in Wimbledon. Richard, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. So just leading on from some of your previous callers in regards to schools, they've all sort of talked about the energy cost. One of my friends works in public health at a very senior level in one of the London boroughs. I'm not going to name the borough, and she focuses on child health and early years provision, and she is incredibly depressed and distressed about the upcoming sort of winter, and specifically in relation to food and the free school meals. Within her borough, there are a lot of disadvantaged children who rely on that free school meal as their one guaranteed meal each day, because when they get home, their families do not know if they're going to be able to put food on the table or put a substantial amount of food or an adequate amount of food on the table. And the cost of that food is just going up, as it is for everybody. But the funding that's provided to schools is not keeping up with inflation.
And so, as we heard from Brian down in Lincoln, the calls upon that budget, that already creaking budget, are growing all the time. And we're now, this is interesting because we know about, it's painful to reflect upon the fact that we know about this, but we do know about children turning up at school hungry. Yeah. But this is now a threat to the one meal every day that they're guaranteed. I've read another story about portions being reduced slightly, money-saving measures being brought into the actual school meal scenario.
Yeah, and if you also look at the last couple of years where these disadvantaged children have been hit really hard by home learning and COVID, and they're already, multiple studies have shown that they're already, worse off than their sort of middle class and upper class peers, because they just haven't had, they haven't been able to sort of keep up with their learning. So again, this is just going to hit them again when they're just kind of getting back into school and getting back on their feet. That they go home and their house may be cold. They go to school and they may have to wear their indoor coats to school.
And that's just the pupils. The teachers are also using food banks and reporting. Well, head teachers can't fill support staff jobs. Pupils are missing out on the COVID catch-up support they urgently need. That was towards the end of last term. Goodness knows what's going to happen when the new term starts. Thank you, Richard. Charlotte's in Nottingham. Charlotte, what would you like to say?
Hi, long-time listener, first-time caller, so I'm a little bit nervous.
It's only me.
Hello. I work for social care, but within the disability sector,
Yes.
disabled children. And we've got a lot of families who are really concerned about the massive, gas and electricity prices, who are concerned that they're not going to be able to afford to keep their medical equipment on that's needed for these young people with complex health needs.
Well, we hear stories about people turning off their fridges overnight. I think they had to issue a warning that you shouldn't do that because you might get botulism or some other horrible disease. So it shouldn't be hard for people listening to believe that these are conversations that are being had in families who spend a lot of money on energy for medical appliances.
Yeah, and raising a child is expensive anyway, but then adding in a complex health needs, it doubles, triples that cost.
Yes.
And then on top of the rising, cost of living and what our children need, we've also got lots of, really not many social workers at all. We've got lots of people off stressed. So it's really, really difficult at the moment.
And where would you traditionally expect help to be coming from? Because it does have an air, all of these conversations, perhaps people in their 60s and 70s might have memories of the lights going out and power cuts and all that kind of thing. But for anybody younger than that, we don't really know what is supposed to happen. There is a family with a dialysis machine, say, for their child, and they're worried they won't be able to afford to actually turn it on. Where would we expect help to come from? Who are you going to call? It's not Ghostbusters.
No, it's really, really difficult, and we're getting lots of calls from our families that we support asking for help, and unfortunately with funding all over the local authorities is really difficult, so heavily relying on charitable organisations to support and
they're going to be getting fewer and fewer donations. I know that food banks are worried that as the more people who used to donate to food banks are now using food banks, so the number of donations goes down.
100%. It's really, really difficult in the social sector, social care sector as a whole, adults and children, and it's really, really difficult.
It's not all bad news, though. I don't know if you saw the High Pay Centre's research in conjunction with the TUC earlier this week that showed that CEO pay in the FTSE 100 companies had increased by 39% in the last year to an average of £3.4 million, Charlotte.
Yeah, they're getting lots of money.
It's not.
But it's like, because even in the fuel, I'm finding it difficult to go on home visits because of the rising cost of fuel. It's all around, all of us, the staff, the children we're supporting it, and I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel.
No, they say this will pass. Inflation will come back down again. The cost of living crisis, when the war in Ukraine ends, will be improved. But it seems to me that this is being exposed now by events rather than caused by events. It's like, they say that when the tide goes out, you can see who's got their trunks on, because you didn't have your trunks on when the tide was in. You get exposed by events. The problems are already there, and you live in a sort of state of hope. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for the work that you do, because, of course, we forget about the psychic toll of all this sort of thing. You are in a caring profession, whether it's teaching or social care or medical care, health care, and the increasing inability to provide the levels of service that you would like to provide is going to take a toll on your mental health. It's going to take a toll on your general well-being. And the mystery for me forever, if you've listened to this programme for a while, you'll know that I've moved politically a bit over the years, but I've never ceased to be stunned. I mean, truly stunned by the way we can live in a country where conversations like this are now commonplace. And yet we learned earlier this week that the FTSE 100, the average income for a CEO of a FTSE 100 company has gone up by 39%. Lawyers, get back to work, you lazy lawyers. You can't have a pay rise, even though 40% of the most junior members of your profession are walking away because they can't make ends meet. Bloody teachers always moaning, always going on strike with their enormous holidays. You're not getting a pay. Railway workers want how much? How much? The average FTSE 100 CEO is now paid 109 times the pay of an average UK worker. That's a bigger gap than before the pandemic. And that's the party of government, essentially. That's all. That's everyone who can turn around and say, yeah, I really like that. That's great. It's a tiny, tiny number of people. The mystery of the forelock tuggers and the cap doffers continues. It's 11:49. James O'Brien on LBC, in case you were wondering. I hope that hasn't taken anyone by surprise. It's a tough day. We're talking about stuff that is commonplace, widespread, and almost unbelievable in the context of what is coming over the horizon and what is already happening to many people. The question about what's the question? The people who wanted this or who I don't know how to reach that constituency. So your cheerleaders now, Gove's walking away, Daily Telegraph's describing Britain as being broken, all manner of problems are being linked to all the things you were persuaded to support, whether it's austerity or Brexit or Boris Johnson's utter unfitness for office. That's the problem, isn't it? The reasons why so much of the country is facing so many problems are so obvious, but so many people are complicit in it. This is the problem. Liz Truss is behaving as if she's the continuity candidate. Many people talking about putting John Redwood and David Frost in the cabinet. There's speculation, as if the real problem with the last 12 years is that we haven't been mad enough. We haven't been mean enough. That is next level nuttiness, isn't it? I mean, imagine that. Imagine looking at what's going on in the country now and thinking, yeah, well, we've been far too generous and nice over the last 12 years. That's why the legal profession is hemorrhaging junior barristers. That's why the health service is hemorrhaging staff. But we've been far too nice, far too generous, far too nice. That's why every sector in the country is reported. I mean, that's the scary bit, because they're in so deep now, and this must apply to voters as well. I don't know what it would be like to be the kind. I mean, what are you going to be, apart from dinghies, obviously, what are you going to be getting cross about now instead of getting cross with the people that have brought our country to its knees? What is it? How's it going to work? I honestly don't know. 11:51 is the time. Jerry's in Telford. Jerry, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
nice to speak to you again. The one sector which hasn't been mentioned, and by all means, is for many people not very important as teachers or nurses, is art and museums. There are massive numbers of artists which I suppose I wouldn't say struggle at this moment, but really the sales just doesn't go the way you would like to go. Now, where I'm sitting now is just a small workshop. And I just recently opened a tiny gallery at the same place. A friend of mine who is an artist, who is a painter, and they do a little bit with the woodwork. Yes. And it's been 2 months since we've opened it, and it's exactly the 2 months where the footfall we increased from the before is massive, but the sales just plummeted almost down to zero. Yeah. I think that one of the biggest reasons is obvious. 2 months ago, everyone started raising the profile of what happened in October with the energy prices, and then what is going to happen in January, let alone any other prices, inflation, etc., etc. So when you go on your summer holiday and you walk for free through the gallery or through the crafts place where we are right now, you put your couple of change in the pocket of thinking, I'll probably rather think about an energy cost rather than buying this lovely painting or whatever art it is. And it's also, to me, I would love to understand the numbers, how the museum's going right now. Is there anyone actually going to the museum thinking, this is the great place, Ironbridge, beautiful, tons of museums around us. You book your holiday down here and then, you booked it somewhere in January where it wasn't brilliant, but it wasn't incredibly and desperate as it is right now. What you're going to do? So it's just to see how little and how other.
Yeah, I mean, it's logical finance thinking. What don't I need to spend money on? And even if I could afford it, I'm not going to buy it because I don't know what's around the corner. What worries me even more is the number of people, and we just discovered this yesterday. I should have thought of it before, but I failed to. The number of people who aren't really across it. Do you know what I mean? They're not really that aware of just how big the impact is going to be come October when your bill is likely to go, the cap. It's in 48 hours that energy companies get the green light to raise bills to £3,500 a year. By January, it could be as much as 6,000. And that's just one of your outgoings. Everything else is going up as well. People, I think, are sleepwalking a lot of the time.
And that is exactly the customer. But then when you are the small, tiny one-man business, is your energy is not capped. I do with the work. All the equipment is obviously on energy intake. That is uncapped. So margins were tiny. But you have made some sales, and then now all of that is actually washed away because the sales are plummeted. So it is, and obviously we cannot complain about the customers because we have in a conversation every single day, and sometimes, I would love to. This is the great piece, and this is incredible. Can you do something for the payments and etc.? We try to do our best, but this industry, which is hardly talked about.
I know because because it's a soft industry, if you like, rather than a frontline caring industry or something like that. But of course, we've got bills to pay, families to support. Everybody does. It's actually very, very hard today to think of anything that might be feeling, apart from CEO pay, which as we know has gone up by 39%, that might be feeling rosy or feeling upbeat. It is genuinely remarkable. Jerry, remind us of the website. Did we crash your website last time you were on?
Yeah, no, thank you. That was the moment of the glory, and my friends still talked about it, and I actually transferred a few friends to listen to it, which I'm actually pleased.
Oh, thank you. So we're quits. But tell people how they can find out about the beautiful door furniture and things that you make.
Yeah, so it's a studio number 10, studio number 10, and we're based at Morse, Jackfield, really close to Iron Bridge. It's a beautiful place to visit.
And you make some beautiful stuff, which I keep meaning to have a proper look at, but our house renovations, like everything else in this country at the moment, are pausing as the cost of materials goes up, which is going to be very relevant to what you've just been saying as well. 11:56 is the time. Alex is in Southport. Alex, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First time caller. Listened for a couple of years.
Thank you, mate.
So I'm a commercial grower up in Southport.
Oh, yeah.
I grow bedding plants for Asda, Aldi, B&Q.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're sort of the backroom suppliers that nobody really sort of sees or knows.
Yes. Well, we'd notice if you weren't there, but we don't necessarily notice when you are.
Exactly. Especially when your gardens are bare. So the struggles we've had is obviously I started during COVID. I changed jobs. Was very lucky to get this job and everything like that. And then since then, it's just been one problem after another. We've had, obviously, with Brexit.
Yeah.
A lot of our agency staff members are from, like sort of Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, and we just can't get the numbers anymore.
Which means the plants don't get picked, which means they don't get put in lorries and they don't end up in supermarkets, which means the money doesn't come in to keep the wheels turning. It's not rocket science, is it?
Yep. And then the next hit, obviously, we then get the war in Ukraine. And
fertilizer.
Yeah, so the Russians have a monopoly on potassium. The Chinese have a monopoly on nitrogen. So they've basically, the global markets for that absolutely skyrocketed. So I think we were paying £20 a bag last year.
Yeah.
And some of them are going up to £90, £110 a bag. Yep. And the thing is, so we're now we've had to cut our fertiliser, the amount of fertiliser we're putting in our tanks every week, which then means the plants suffer, the quality suffers, they don't sell. It's one big chain, really.
And you're part. I mean, I don't know what words to say. I'm so glad you've rung in. Obviously, I'm gutted for you that you've got these stories to tell. But it's a brilliant example of what I was actually describing, isn't it? It's you said yourself, out of sight, out of mind. All the stuff that's going on away from the sectors that make the headlines. Like the law or the health service or social care. But it's all part of the big machine. It's all part of the economic system. Are you under existential? I mean, can you see a point where you won't be able to carry on?
At the minute, we don't know. At the minute,
No.
The company I work for. Obviously, we're trying to grind on as much as we can.
Yes,
but then you're looking at the winter fuel costs, and I mean, we normally grow greenhouses in winter.
Yeah.
But we haven't grown them this year, thank God, because otherwise that would have been a massive cost because they need 15 degrees all winter. So most of us, we're lucky that most of the things only need heat, frost protection. But if they come on, it's
going to be, and the bills are going to be epic, and there will be no cap on them because it's a commercial premises. Oh, boy. Daily Mirror running a campaign, the energy crisis urgent, plea as prices set to soar, act now or it's catastrophe, picking up on a lot of the things that our callers have picked up on, except, of course, that this speaks directly to the domestic energy bills. When October 2022, the average is likely to hit 3,544, and then in January of next year, 4,200. It could, of course, be more. It could be as much as 6. Who knows? Some of the forecasts by the companies are eye-watering, but I guess the people perhaps we should not be most worried about, but should be more worried about the people who haven't actually got a clue what's coming up on the horizon, because it looks a hell of a lot like another iceberg. It is 3 minutes after 12 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Two things. We're going to talk about the tragic events, the horrific events in Liverpool for the next hour. Obviously, the murder of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell being at the forefront of our thoughts. But so there's a warning there that it's going to be grisly. But also a reminder that an arrest has been made, which means that we need to be careful about some elements of the conversation. I'm fairly confident that won't become an issue, but just be aware. Don't, because I'm going to ask you some interesting questions shortly. And first of all, I'm going to run you through the details of this story, which I hadn't fully appreciated until Sheila started speaking yesterday. And to be honest with you, it was actually the look on her face when she came into the studio that hit me as much as the words that she then spoke. Obviously, Sheila Fogarty is from Liverpool, very much a daughter of the city. And it is a city that inspires remarkable levels of loyalty from its citizens. It's not a city that I know well. My wife went to university there. She retains an enormous affection for Liverpool, but for what it's worth, I spent a lot of time in Manchester as a kid, and it seems historically always to be one or the other, doesn't it? It's not. But what happened was unbelievable, and what was so jarring about the experience was the banality of it, if that's the right word. The fact that you go from sitting at home with the kids asleep upstairs watching a bit of telly to having your dying daughter in your arms. So I don't know how much detail, you're probably fully across it, so I'll run through briefly what happened. What would appear to be a gangland scenario, an attempted assassination was underway. Gunshots were heard. A woman, a mother, opens her front door to see what the noise is about, and the target of the apparent assassination attempt runs towards the light in the hope of getting away from his pursuers. The pursuers follow, open fire in a suburban sitting room. The mother is hit in the arm, and the bullet continues its trajectory into the chest of her 9-year-old daughter, who is now dead. Just think about that. Would you open your front door? You'd look out the window, wouldn't you? What's that noise? I'll just go and have a look. Is it a car backfire? I mean, we talk a lot about the thinness of the veneer between stability and chaos, because I think it explains a lot. I think the desperation to believe that stability is sustainable and chaos is never going to hit us, I think it's one of the great engines of humanity. It's only quite late in life I've come to this understanding, because I spend a lot of time now wondering how people can end up believing things that are simply not true or are damaging to your own interest, against your own interest. And a lot of it is driven by a desire for stability. You need to believe that the bad stuff couldn't happen to you. I began to see the light on this when I was puzzling over a lot of the abuse that the parents of Madeleine McCann received after her abduction. And I was really puzzled where the initial impulse for millions of people would be enormous undiluted sympathy. For others, it was a rush to judgment and a very quick journey to criticism and condemnation, and worse, some of the trolling and stuff online. And look, some people are just nasty, of course. I don't think they were born that way, but the decent people who end up doing indecent things, I think, are largely driven by a weird form of self-protection. You want to believe it couldn't happen to you. You want to believe that the fickle finger of fate couldn't end up pointing at you. So the people to whom bad stuff happens must somehow be to blame. I think actually it also explains quite a lot of racism when it comes to crime. A lot of people who say, oh, it's a problem in the black community are doing so to reassure themselves that as a white person it couldn't happen to them. Of course, even a cursory understanding of the relationship between poverty and crime and ethnicity and poverty completely blows that ship out of the water. Just have a look at what was going on in Glasgow. Read a Carla and have a look at what was going on among the poorest communities in Glasgow. The poorest communities will always have the most violent crime. And the poorest communities as well in post-imperial Britain will always have the highest levels of ethnic minority. So it's not the colour of the skin that causes the crime, it's the contents of the bank accounts. But it's reassuring, especially for, middle-class white people with newspaper columns, to say that, well, it's a black problem. That's why we've got to stop and search. We've got to treat all black people like criminals in the hope of catching the ones that are, because it's never going to affect you. And you derive a degree of reassurance from the thought that it's never going to affect you. And I think that's why this story has landed so hard. I think it would have landed even harder if it had been in London, because the kind of people I'm talking about would have been able to pretend it was somehow Sadiq Khan's fault. So when crimes happen here, it's all Sadiq Khan's fault. Nothing to do with the police or the Home Secretary or 12 years of Tory government. All about Sadiq Khan. All about Sadiq Khan, who could almost certainly have done a better job in this sphere. But the idea that it's all his fault is a bit like, the dinghies. It's actually fuel to the fire of the people who profess their outrage all the time. They're loving their outrage. But this is a story where you cannot even begin to frame a narrative that somehow reassures you that it couldn't happen to you. This is literally the fickle finger of fate turning up on your doorstep, uninvited, unwanted, and unwelcome. It's absolutely terrifying, this story. Now, you may be slightly insulated from having a similarly horrible experience because you live in a smarter part of town. But you're only a bit insulated. Who knows where cars stop or where people drive or where you get seen. And there is, I think, absolutely no way, although someone will probably try, there's no way you can have this conversation with that little undercurrent of self-protection. The thing, it couldn't happen to me. Because the statistics, the facts of the story are so heartbreaking. A little girl, a front door, a suburban neighbourhood, an unbelievable tragedy. And it reminds us, and this is the bit I do understand, it reminds us how fragile stability is. And that's the point. Some people resist furiously the notion that stability is fragile. They have to believe that the bad stuff only happens to bad people. And I talked yesterday about how it actually can lead to fascism. The idea if everybody is like me, then it will be safe, and everybody who's not like me will be the enemy. I mean, it is this desperation for stability that is a human engine. We don't all have it. I don't have it. But that's the thing, isn't it? It's a reminder, this story, of how tissue thin security and stability can be. And you can't fix it. There will always be tragedy. There will always be terrible things done by terrible people. Man's inhumanity to man, it deepens like the coastal shelf. You can't ever get rid of it. Whatever tabloid newspaper journalists may pretend and whatever politicians may profess, bad things will always happen to good people, and they'll be done by people who've turned bad. So I'm not a fan, you may be surprised to learn, of the Daily Mail newspaper. So what I thought we would do today is look at the suggestion, which I think is quite well supported, that there is something rotten in the city of Liverpool. I know that is and a lot of people are pointing out Notty Ash is a middle-class area. It's a relatively smart part of town. I knew that. It was a point I was making about thinking you were insulated from this by the poorer parts of town. The Daily Mail lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 14 people who've already died this year as victims of violent crime. How much of that is gang-linked, we'll dig into together. But we also know London faces all manner of problems. Birmingham has seen its murder rate go up by quite a lot in recent years, although they've got a Conservative mayor down there, so you don't read about it in the newspapers quite as much as you would if there was a Labour mayor. I mean, here is a snapshot of the violence that has erupted in Liverpool in recent weeks. June the 21st, 16-year-old boy dropped off at Royal Liverpool Hospital with gunshot wounds. July the 2nd, 23-year-old man arrives at hospital with gunshot wounds to his legs and back. July the 5th, man in his 50s stabbed in chest and stomach. July 28th, man stabbed in Walton. July the 31st, man shot in the leg in a pub car park. August the 8th, shots fired from a dark-coloured car parked in Finch Way. August the 9th, police officers threatened with gun by man in Balaclava. Only last month, two men were convicted at Liverpool Crown Court of the street execution of a 26-year-old father of two, shot twice in the chest in broad daylight. Someone described as a teenage cannabis kingpin was jailed for 9 years and 8 months. In April, he was only 17. His name's Obrien. He was 16 when he took over as leader of a squad of drug dealers behind 3 shootings and a firebombing. I hate the way Liverpool, perhaps more than any other city in this country, has, I think partly because of Hillsborough, but there must have been a vile prejudice in place when the disgraced former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, decided to print that disgusting front page about the Hillsborough tragedy. But since Hillsborough and since the right-wing media indulged in the most disgusting cover-up and misdirection imaginable, Liverpool has been a city that seems to get more than its fair share of criticism. So I'm conscious of that as I prepare to ask you this question, because I don't want it to sound like I'm adding to that sense, and certainly drawing upon the Daily Mail's research into the gangland gun horrors that haunt an entire city doesn't come naturally to me. But it was the collection of photographs. And it was Ashley Dale, the 28-year-old council environmental health worker, shot dead in a case of mistaken identity, apparently, but then learning that her brother had been shot dead years before in another case of mistaken identity. I don't have all the statistics at my fingertips. I don't have the comparisons in place. I don't even off the top of my head know what the population of Liverpool is. But I do know that this isn't right, and I don't think that it's normal. So does Liverpool have a particular problem? And if so, why? What is the problem at the moment in Liverpool? What is going on? 0345 6060 973. And feel free, I mean, not from your heart necessarily, but from your head, to tell me that it doesn't. It's no different from any other comparable city in the United Kingdom. Because just looking through the lens of these 2 tragedies in the last week, particularly this one, and the fact that it was the 15th anniversary, if you were watching the football the other night, you'd have seen the reminder come up that it was the 15th anniversary of the killing of 11-year-old Rhys Jones, caught in a conflict between rival gangs while on his way home from football practice. Has Liverpool got a very particular problem? Or not? 0345 6060 973. And if it does, what is the problem? What is it? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And be sensitive and be aware of the fact that Liverpool often... Well, just remember Hillsborough and the appalling abuse visited upon the people of Liverpool by Rupert Murdoch's newspapers and others in the media, and steer a million miles away from anything that sounds like it might be part of that. It's 12:17. It is 12:19, and it's. I hope it's if not a silly question, then one that will be swiftly answered. But there is a sense, isn't there, given the death of little Olivia, the fourth Liverpool murder in a week, that something is going on in the city that needs to stop. Daily Mail's language is part of a dark underbelly too often driven by a violent drugs trade. But, that won't have been written by someone who lives in Liverpool. If you do, or if you know the city well, just talk to me about whether or not it does have a particular problem, or whether or not this is just typical of big cities in this country at this time. 20 minutes after 12. Josh is in Oxford, which is not in Liverpool.
Hello, hi.
Hello, Josh, mate. You're from Liverpool, obviously.
Yeah, so I'm from Liverpool. I left quite a while ago, to be honest. So I've just come on to speak about a bit of a drug and gang culture that exists in the city.
Okay.
And I was born in 1993, but I believe it started a long time before that. So I've looked into a bit of history, obviously the history of Liverpool, and with its history with the ports. And I think a lot of the drugs found their way into Liverpool quite easily in the era of the 1980s, when the ports were in, full swing.
Yeah.
And that's when a lot of the drug gangs in Liverpool, that's where a lot of it began. And then it became quite a culture in the city that, drugs were a thing to get involved in. And then you got a lot of families that began to get involved in the trade. And these families became household names in the city. So,
right.
Even myself.
Don't say any, because I don't know what the libel situation is.
Sure,
but you mean like kind of, celebrities almost.
Yeah, I would say they became celebrities. And, obviously when you're growing up as a young lad and you're a teenager and you want to maybe give the impression you're a bit cool, and you give the impression that, you're aware of these people, you may know people in connection with them. And you're just, obviously, like I say, you're wanting to kind of make a name for yourself. So this culture, it's a very easy thing to just move into and kind of get that name for yourself, if you know what I mean.
And if we're looking for things that are peculiar to Liverpool, the port status is going to be part of it, because that's where the drugs will come in, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why Liverpool found its name as one of the drug capitals of the country, is because of the port. And I think that's where a lot of the drug gangs were able to get on top, because they were kind of first in line for the yes. large amounts, so to speak, and then they got. Well, you'd need
people, you'd need contacts on the docks, wouldn't you, to get the drugs off the ship?
Yeah, you would. So it was a very organised thing from, I'm going back to the 1980s. It was a very organised thing. So I think that's probably quite unique to Liverpool, really.
Maybe.
And I think that could be really, obviously.
And then the killings and the violence become turf wars, as it were, for control of the trade, which is not unique to Liverpool. That's common wherever there are drug dealers and drug gangs. But the peculiar bit, the bit that's particular to Liverpool, would be the quantity, the scale, because they're the first port of call, literally, to coin a phrase. They're the first port of call for the contraband, for the drugs. Why did you leave? Why did you move out?
I just wanted to get out and see the world a bit, so I just moved around a little bit.
Okay.
Went across to Canada and then come back to the UK. But it was kind of a difficult thing for me to get out of. I wasn't really in the drug trade, so to speak, but kind of that mentality and that the psyche, that's very easy to get into. It was a hard thing for me to get out of as a young lad, and I know a lot of young lads struggle with that growing up in Liverpool, and I think it's just a mentality thing. They don't really look to kind of go into a profession. They just see that as an easy way just to make money. And that's interesting. So that idea of the drug gangs being so prevalent that it's hard not to be a teenage boy looking up. Because we speak about this in communities in London. We speak about this in parts of London, postcodes in London. You're speaking as if it was citywide. Yeah, almost definitely. It's citywide. It's not limited to certain areas at all. No, it's a citywide thing. It's in every school.
Right.
You know, every kid wants that status. Really, not every kid.
No, sure.
But obviously,
but there will be a kid in every school, or there will be kids in every school that are.
Exactly. Yeah, that wants that status as a drug dealer, and when obviously they're growing up and they see this culture and these people becoming almost celebrities with the status, and see them in the flash cars and whatnot.
Yeah. That's true. We hear that in the context of other cities, but never on a citywide level. At least I don't, and it's perfectly possible that I'm just got my head in the sand, or that I'm too naive to have noticed. Josh, thank you. That's a kick-off, a reluctant one. I guess clubs are going to have been part of it as well. Back in the 80s, Cream was a massive super club, and a lot of drugs driving the whole of that culture, which, presumably raised such enormous revenues that people were prepared to fight and kill for control of them. Josh, thank you. Gavin's in Nottingham. Gavin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Before I start, I just wanted to tell you that the murder itself the other night was in Dovecot, not in Nottingham, which is very close to Nottingham.
Right, you are.
But the two have been slightly conflated.
Yes.
And that has its own challenges, that part of that community in Dovecot.
Okay.
I'm a filmmaker based here in Liverpool, and I understand the historical aspect that the previous caller referred to.
Yes.
But there's a real despair, and I trace that to social and economic despair in the city at the moment, which is making a lot of young people very ripe for grooming.
Why would that be particular to Liverpool, though?
Well, it's not particular to Liverpool,
no.
But the character of Liverpool people, there's a real sort of militant sort of there's an indomitable streak in our character that I just think there's a sort of recalcitrant, and we're really anti, we're sort of belligerent lot, and I think that's within the character, and I think that this is where a lot of these kids, and I was witness to a siege in my own street about 3 weeks ago.
Good grief.
Seeing a young kid of 13 years old being let out, the whole street was under a siege. And I say it's despair because they've got nothing to aspire to. Their peer groups are obviously, and I put it down to a lot of conspicuous consumption. They see what they can get very easily, and there's no other direction they can go in. So I want that. How ruthless can I be to get that? And they're being enlisted. I mean, we call them soldiers, whatever you want to describe them as.
Right.
And they're being recruited very easily, and they're going out and being dispatched to do all sorts of things. And the only way you get on is to be more ruthless and more vicious than the next one who's in charge and command at the moment. And
so, I mean, these are all
that on a day-to-day basis.
These are universal themes, aren't they?
They are, of course, they are.
Absence of opportunity, the glamorization of material goods, the cars, the clothes, the clubs.
Broken down families, absent parents. Or it's a conglomerate. I mean, it's a complete. It's not particular to Liverpool. I just think that last, and it's all tit for tat as well. I mean, I was speaking to somebody yesterday who's got inside knowledge of what happened on Saturday.
Okay, don't go there.
Rid of the young girl. Won't go there. No, won't go there. Okay. I'm an extremist myself, so I know.
Okay.
And he was saying that the person, there was an association with the girl who and it ended up.
No, that's not. I see the sad. Yeah, they're different. God, I'm getting my crimes and my murders mixed up. But I mean, what about the ease with which guns can be got? Is it easier in Liverpool than it would be elsewhere?
Oh yeah, I mean, we had a whole situation a while back. Like I called a librarian who was actually building decommissioned guns. Very easy to commission guns that have been decommissioned. They're floating around all over the place, and it's not just guns; it's knives as well. There's the accessibility to it. And I said it all comes because I don't sound like an old flow. I don't see a copper on my street. You don't. The police forces have dropped in the city considerably. Your police stations are closed. My local police station's been closed now.
Yes.
I reported an incident the other week. I was told to go to Southport, which
good Lord.
And
this is all at the door of the Home Office, really. In a normal country, in a functioning democracy, you look at the government department that has responsibility for all of the things that you've touched upon. So I'm sure everyone in Liverpool will be very delighted and relieved to learn that Priti Patel yesterday accompanied the police on a raid. with a camera crew. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. Gavin, thank you for that. There is a sense that Liverpool perhaps has demons that other cities don't have on quite the same scale for historical reasons rather than anything else. If you don't agree with that, feel free to set the record straight. And what's it like there then on a day-to-day basis? Is it a city? Because this is the distinction between postcodes and entire cities. So I don't know, most middle-class people like me, southern London middle-class people like me, we're going to get our information from fiction a lot of the time. We're going to watch Top Boy on the telly or something like that, and we're going to feel, well, I don't live on an estate like Summerland, so I'm absolutely fine. I get the air from the first two callers that you don't have that compartmentalisation in Liverpool that you have in London. Is that a fair comment? I am absolutely ignorant on these issues, and I'm conscious of not wanting to... Well, if I do upset you or offend you, it will be very much by accident, and not like Boris Johnson when he was editing The Spectator, deliberately setting out to offend the people of Liverpool for, attention and notoriety. But it does seem to me perhaps that where in London the criminality, this kind of criminality is compartmentalised and contained, occasionally, of course, it breaks out. In Liverpool, it would appear that is not the case. That would be the first cautious conclusion I'd draw from my early callers, but you are obviously and always welcome to contradict them. 12:31 is the time. Tim Humphrey is here now with your headline. It is 12:34, and it is tempting to wonder what is happening in Liverpool, given the frequency of apparently gang-related violence culminating this week in the murder in her own home of a 9-year-old girl, Olivia Pratt-Corbell. I mean, if you can't feel safe in your own home, then something really rotten is afoot, isn't it? 12:34 is the time. Carl is in Liverpool. Carl, what can you tell us?
Hi, James. Big fan. First time caller.
Welcome.
Liverpool is... We're suffering from one-upmanship now when it comes to violence.
Go on.
Things are just escalating because if you think about the people of Liverpool, we all live probably one generation away from poverty. We live in the spectre of it. We know an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a parent, a grandparent, to the extremes, who've lived with nothing, who've experienced Thatcherism and Hillsborough and the cover-up and the things that we can't rely on anyone else. So when you live in the spectre of this poverty, some people will do anything to never go back there. They will take the biggest risks that you and I could imagine. I'm 39 now, so I grew up in the mid-90s in Anfield, and it was some of the things I seen no one should see, let alone kids. Right. You shouldn't see violence and anger and misplaced, trust in people like those celebrities that were...
So celebrity gangsters is the phrase that we're looking for, isn't it?
Because the only way you get away from being fascinated by that is if you were a boxer or a footballer in the pool.
So if you wanted wealth, if you wanted notable wealth, those were your three paths: boxing, football, crime, drugs, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, a rebellion.
Why just back up for me a bit and tell me why this would be more acute or more true in Liverpool than Glasgow or Birmingham?
How many other cities have been labelled as villains and being told just cut the city off and let it die? How many other cities have experienced, let's say, a governmental cover-up about what happened to their fans? It compacts. So
I mean, Hillsborough obviously. Hillsborough is unique to Liverpool. I understand that, but the socio-economic damage of Thatcherism, that surely would apply just as much in former mining communities, in Sheffield with the steel, in the Midlands with the cars, wouldn't it? I mean, I'm not picking holes in what you're saying. I'm just trying to understand it better.
Absolutely, it would, but we also have a massive port.
Yes.
Which plays into the fact that drugs, guns,
so that's the avenue that is open.
Accessibility.
Yeah, right, you are. So that you could say the same things about other cities, but they're not going to have essentially a whopping great shop window for insane amounts of drugs to come into the country. And if you know the right people and make the right connections, you can get a piece of the action.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy money. You can be a 17-year-old, I think you spoke earlier, who's known as a drugs kingpin. You can be the hardest man in the world at 5'8" because you know how to pull a trigger. You can be all the things that traditionally anywhere else you couldn't be. You couldn't be the biggest, hardest doorman in Liverpool if you were 5'8" and 11 stone. But if you've got a good trigger finger, people will fear you, and fear or love. I mean, fear rules this town.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's a pretty irresistible exception then. The port status, literally the fact that the drugs are coming in. This is the point of entry. So while there'll be gangs and other people in other cities, it's going to be in a different order of magnitude. It's going to be a different game from the game that it is in the city where it starts, in the city where it comes in, the city where it happens, as it were. How do you avoid it then growing up? Because, there'll be lots of teenagers, lots of lads in Liverpool who don't get caught up in it all, won't there?
Yeah, well, the way to avoid it is usually by looking at it and thinking that risk is too. It's an internal thing. The risk is too great.
So it's about what you've got to lose.
Some people with lack of education,
yes,
will not see that. They will just jump at the opportunity to make 10 grand and think that's great. But if you worked in McDonald's, you could make 16 over the year. But they go, yeah, but I can earn 10 this week.
Yeah.
It is.
And is it open to
people?
Would it be open to almost everybody? If you felt that you had so little to lose that the risk was worth it, you could fairly quickly get yourself a position in the chain, in the supply chain.
It's actually easier when you're younger, because if you're looking for somewhere to belong, if you're looking for a group of people who will look after you, if you think about Liverpool as a town, it's not the most affluent as a city. No. So the majority of people here will work as carers, they will work as shop assistants, they will work in McDonald's, they will work in places like that. So right now, with the likes of the cost of living crisis,
it's going to get worse.
2 jobs. That's 3 jobs. If no one's at home, it does play a part. If people are out and mum's working for 16 grand in one job and 3 in another, and she's never in the house, and you can make 10 grand in 2 weeks by doing this thing for this guy.
And so that's where in a way the demonisation of Liverpudlians comes from, in the same way that in the southeast right-wing people pretend that it's a race issue. They can't do that in Liverpool. So you pretend that there's something peculiar to Liverpudlians, which is where the demonisation of the Scouser comes from. And that's precisely the bandwagon. That's precisely the bandwagon that people like Boris Johnson are jumping on when they commission vile pieces about the victim culture of your town, of your home.
Well, I sound the way I do, and people don't associate that with intelligence. They don't associate it with culture. They don't know me, and the stereotype will just build and build and build, because you can't really fight it. Because for every person who goes and works in the civil service or for the police or in the law, who sounds like me, you get 10 stories about men pointing guns at the police and the police having to drive away because they can't deal with it, or 9-year-olds being shot, or Reece Jones, or So it's tough.
Yeah, I hear you. I do, and it's odd, isn't it? I don't know. You can probably appreciate it's odd for me as a Londoner with no real knowledge of Liverpool to hear you describing it as almost a country within a country.
We're Scouse, not English.
There it is.
That we have been cut off. We feel like, and we can only talk about how we feel.
Yeah.
We feel like we've been cut off from the rest of the country because we've seen pieces of governmental paper that say just let the city rot.
Well, that's a matter of historical record, isn't it? That's although then you have someone like Heseltine who seemed to have a particular warmth for Liverpool, a particular positivity for Liverpool. But I don't.
But is that because he loved the cheeky Scouser?
Or because he recognised that it needed more help than other cities did, which in fact enforces your point more than anything else. Carl, thank you, mate. I don't imagine that was an easy call for you to make, so I'm very grateful to you for doing it.
No, very nervous. Thanks.
You played a blinder. Thank you. And remember, you can disagree. In fact, I think Mike, who's up next, might be about to disagree with Carl, but I just want to give you a quick bit of context why we mentioned Boris Johnson. When he was editor of The Spectator, he commissioned an article that accused the city of wallowing in its victim status after a Liverpudlian called Ken Bigley was murdered by Islamist terrorists and wallowing in victim status over the 1989 Hillsborough football stadium disaster, after which the residents of the city, not just the supporters of the club, spent years being accused of causing the deaths of Liverpool fans that day, a despicable lie that in many ways had its beginnings in the putrid mind of the disgraced former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. So there is a lot of history to the relationship between rancid right-wing media, in this case represented by Boris Johnson, and the city of Liverpool, which is where Mike has called me from. Mike, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James. I don't actually want to disagree with what Carl said.
No, I know you don't, because I just saw the word port on the screen, and because I thought you were going to say we're no different from any other city in the world, but it's port city in the world, isn't it?
And I think that's certainly something that if you look at all the major port cities in the world, Rotterdam, Glasgow, New York, Catania, they all have issues around a gangland culture that supports a thriving drugs trade. Liverpool is no different from any of those cities, in my opinion. Yeah. I think Liverpool is probably unique in its place, where it's got a population that has been fairly static, if not declining. But at the weekends, Liverpool's population swells massively with the number of tourists that come here because of the football and the Beatles and the fact that it's a fantastic city to enjoy a night out in. Where you're getting a huge influx of people, that creates a ready-made market, and these people who are supplying the people who come into the city at the weekends, they're aware of that.
Right.
Where there's been an absence of opportunity for high-paid and high-skilled jobs, where there's a void, people step into that space, and if they can, it can be very, very lucrative doing what they do.
So you've got that mobile customer base coming in and out at weekends. You've got the port status for bringing it in, and then you've got I suppose the first caller took us back to the 80s. You're talking about the rise of the super clubs as well, and the fact that ecstasy went hand in hand with that, and those structures, those gangs, and in some cases those individuals will have moved on to other drugs subsequently.
Yeah,
all of which are coming in via the same routes to the same port.
Yeah, and Liverpool's had links with cities all over the country. Scotland links to Scotland, links to places all over the country, and they've exploited that.
Do you have any sense that the current, just this, the fourth murder in a week is obviously going to draw attention specifically. Is it anomalous? Is it not actually extraordinary in the context of criminality in Liverpool? It's just that if you like, I don't know, events have conspired, the planets have aligned, and you've just got an uptick rather than an escalation. It will go back down again, but it is the underlying story hasn't changed at all. Or have things got measurably worse in the last months or year?
No, I think if you look at historically, obviously the events that have happened in the last week have been absolutely devastating, not only for the city, but devastating for families and also the city in general. As somebody who is raising 3 young boys in the city, as somebody who's lived abroad for 5 years who could have went anywhere.
Yeah.
I chose to come back and settle my family here because Liverpool is a fundamentally safe place. Yeah,
Right.
I live in a nice area.
Okay.
But you're not 10 minutes away from not so nice areas where
Yeah.
you have, they have these ingrained problems. I don't think it's something that's unique to Liverpool.
No, I hear you. I get it. So will there be a unique collection of circumstances? But you're going to have a unique collection of circumstances everywhere, and a lot of the circumstances will be the same. The variables will be things like geography and mobile population. Briefly, what do you do when one of your lads gets his head turned by the gangster in the BMW or whatever it is?
Well, it's about education, isn't it? It's about instilling the right values in your children. You know, I'm not professing to be Father of the Year, but I was brought up with right values, and I live in a nice area now, but I was brought up and born in areas very similar to ones that have been mentioned previously. You know, I was brought up with a strong work ethic.
Yeah.
From my family, that runs through Liverpool. You know, people have a work ethic here. You know, I work for a company that is southern based, and I look after the area for them. There's a lot going for Liverpool.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. It's important.
The events that have happened are absolutely tragic, but I think it's a perfect storm based on, you know, there's been everything that's gone on with the National Crime Agency and EncroChat and things like that. That has created a void that people have been arrested and put in prison. And it looks like people are fighting over turf. That's what it looks like. And unfortunately,
that's what it is.
You know, innocent people have been caught up in that. Mike, and it's tragic.
I mean, that's something everyone can agree on. It's tragic, almost beyond description. The mental images you conjure up when you read about what actually happened in that house on that night it shakes all of your certainties, all of your solidity. Thank you, Mike. That was incredibly helpful. It's 10-1. It is 12:52. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC as we continue to survey the recent tragedies in Liverpool and wonder whether there is something peculiar to the city that has created these atmospheres. And the answer is perhaps predictably both yes and no. I mean, you know, whether you focus on the port status or whether you focus upon the culture of nightclubs that grew up long before the 1980s, but when the Class A drugs became a huge part of the scene in the 1980s and 1990s, epic amounts of money began to swill around a city that had a portal, if you like, to the parts of the world where those drugs were produced. And therefore elements of this, as long as drugs remain criminalised, elements of this perhaps remain inevitable. But it certainly feels, as it was just beautifully described by Michael there, a perfect storm this week with 4 deaths already, and against a backdrop I read you at the beginning of the hour of a catalogue just going back to June of the 21st, a catalogue of crimes that appear to be gang linked. Stephen is in the city. Stephen, what would you like to say?
Yeah, for me, basically, I was just so saddened by everything. You know what I mean? It was Sunday. I think it was Saturday or Sunday. A woman got killed, and then Monday night, it's just devastating. You just think to yourself, what is going on? I just think...
You're from London originally, are you? And you've moved up to Liverpool?
I'm from London originally, yeah, and I've moved up to Liverpool. Lovely city, lovely people. Yeah. They're the most friendliest people you could ever meet.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I do. I work with Sheila Fogarty, of course I do.
I don't want us to get it twisted.
Right.
And start focusing on Liverpool.
No.
Do you know what I mean? Because
it's
a big tragedy. But what I think is society on the whole is broken. It's just broken, especially for the young generation growing up. And I see it a lot in Liverpool. Really, a lot in Liverpool. There's not really a lot for them to do. You know, it's like the 2 gentlemen before you was talking. You know that you can make 10 grand in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? To a young teenager, 17, 18-year-old, you know, he's going to think, why should I go out working?
It's going to turn a lot of heads, that. It's going to turn relatively sensible heads as well when you're young, aren't you? And you've got, the head is somewhat hotter
Yes, and what I was saying to your researchers, the person I spoke to before, is you haven't just got it. It's not just in like one area in Liverpool.
No.
It's in several pockets of different areas all around Liverpool. And Liverpool's it's very small. Do you know what I mean? And that's what's happened. And plus, they feel like Liverpudlians.
Yeah.
The whole of Liverpool, like the gentleman said before.
Mate, I'm not interrupting you. You've got to change the battery in your smoke alarm, Stephen, after this call.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear it in the background?
Yeah, I can hear it.
No, seriously, that's promise me you'll do that.
Yeah, I will.
All right, carry on.
Yeah, so Liverpool is like a country within a country. That's why they boo the national anthem. It goes way back to the 80s when they got left out and nobody didn't, and that's when the infrastructure of the drugs came in because there was no work, there was nothing for people to do, and they needed to put food on the table. People
absence of opportunity, and I mean,
yes.
People listening to this who are unfamiliar. I'm going to let you go and change that battery now, Stephen. Thank you for the call. They'd probably be a little bit surprised to learn about what Geoffrey Howe wrote to Margaret Thatcher shortly after, in her first term as Prime Minister after some riots in Liverpool in Toxteth in about 1981. Letter came out years later in which it saw that she was being urged to abandon Liverpool to managed decline by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Geoffrey Howe. Quite incredible, really. I fear that Merseyside is going to be much the hardest nut to crack, he said, after warning her not to overcommit scarce resources to Liverpool. We do not want to find ourselves concentrating all the limited cash that may have to be made available into Liverpool and having nothing left for possibly more promising areas. What does that mean? Such as the West Midlands or even the North East. Even. That's a loaded word. This is how they talk about you, these Tories. And remember, the current crop are worse than this lot. The current crop are like this lot, but without the brains, without the diabolical genius. They've just got the slogans and the flags. Even the North East. Even the North East. It would be even more regrettable if some of the brighter ideas for renewing economic activity were to be sown only on relatively stony ground on the banks of the Mersey. I cannot help feeling that the option of managed decline is one which we should not forget altogether. We must not expend all our limited resources in trying to make water flow uphill. And then just a few years later, Boris Johnson commissioned Simon Heffer to deliberately and grossly insult every single person in the city. So there is something peculiar about Liverpool, but not necessarily what some of the newspaper coverage of the recent tragedies want you to think it is. You can tell that I'm watching my P's and Q's as I conclude this conversation about one of our country's greatest cities, because one of that city's greatest daughters has waltzed into the studio preparing to take up her time behind the microphone. But I've got a little moment left to ask you whether there is something. I mean, what's the word? I say peculiar to or special about.
I'm wary of it, but I also accept that it's at least partly true. Because the reason I'm wary of it is that the vast majority of people living in Liverpool just want to do what you and I want to do, which was to live, breathe, stay safe, have a job, have a family, and go about their business normally. So there's nothing unique in that. But I think every city, every place has a unique character. And Liverpool does have a unique character, no doubt. And it's been a radical character since way, way, way before the 80s, go back to 120, 150
years ago.
Yes,
We didn't pick up on that.
It's been a really radical city.
Exactly, yes.
Sometimes for good, sometimes for ill, I would say as well. So, but the reason I absolutely love it and love the vast majority of the people who are from it, as I am, is that there's something defiant about it. And I think in this world, at various points in time, we've needed a huge amount of defiance just to survive. And I think now is one of them, actually. Yeah. And I think that defiance, you saw it in the Hillsborough families. And I heard one of your callers talking about, poverty. And he's right, huge poverty historically in the city as well. Not for everybody, but for many. But the vast majority of people don't turn to crime when poverty happens. And it's,
yes, exactly.
But it has a defiant city. And I think the idea of it being a place within the wider country, but separate from the wider country is really true.
Thank you. That was helpful. Do you want to do a show now?
I think I will.
Show now.
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 I think
trời chiều không màu nắng ấm, thầm thầm buồn vọng nhớ về đâu. Phương trời xa ai nào hay biết,